Listen. In the first breath you will know you are not meant to hear this. Imagine a single bell in humid Charleston, a rope that creaks, then a sentence scratched into a leather journal. They buried 9 men and called it mercy. That line is a blade. It parts the polite fabric of a city that prays while accounting for human lives beneath its flaws. When the bell stops, you find yourself at the lip of a secret they paid to keep. This is not a ghost story. It is a ledger of slow violence written in ink. At its center is Solomon Fairfax, healer, reader of Latin, keeper of remedies, a man whose hands learned both to soothe and to remember. Trained to mend, forced to watch his family listed as commodity, his life became a paradox that hardened into purpose. Picture Solomon in the small room above a physician's practice, candlelight pooling across his journal. The first entry is a collapse. A wagon wheel strikes a rut. A woman's head meets stone, children sold, a father left shackled and silent in a market. The moment severs something sacred. The healer becomes witness. Charleston's grandeur is a costume. White columns and pulpits mask an economy built on separation. Gentlemen who lectured on virtue sat at auction blocks with the same steady hands, donating to charity in the morning, bidding on families by noon. That cognitive dissonance is the city's pulse. It beats strongest where reputation must be preserved, in parlors, hospitals, and societies that trade in appearances. Solomon was taken into Dr. Hathaway's world because his skill made him invaluable. In the clinic, he moved like a shadow in daylight, visible to the wealthy, invisible in their rationales. He learned their words of denial: poor constitution, bad climate, unfortunate predisposition. Those phrases functioned as alibis. He catalogued them. The journal's opening pages are clinical and diva-sounds. They refuse to dramatize cruelty. They show instead how institutions render it mundane. Solomon traces connections, who financed traders, who smiled at auctions, who preached charity while counting profits. His observations are precise, almost medical. He treats the city's moral sickness like pathology, not to instruct harm, but to expose how civilized rituals conceal injury. The darkest cruelty is the soft language that buries truth under ceremony. A donation, a name on a plaque, a funeral sermon, these smooth conscience. Solomon perceived this and refused its mercy. He wrote to puncture the surface, to make the wound visible. This matters for you listening now. This story demands witness, not voyeurism. Reading becomes moral labor. You are asked to hold memory others would erase. Solomon's pen is indictment. He records a laugh at an auction, a sermon that followed, and folds those acts into history so they cannot be rephrased into gentility. Do not seek spectacle. The horror is recognition. When the journal mentions nails scratched into coffin lids and bodies frozen mid-struggle, the terror is not gore, but the knowledge that institutions could declare such deaths natural. That power to name truth falsely, to wrap atrocity in medical terms and polite obituaries, is the rot Solomon confronts. So breathe and listen. This first page is initiation. You are invited into a process that strips comfortable narratives. Each passage will take you deeper, asking questions you may not want to answer. This is dangerous knowledge because it obliges action, to remember, to witness, to refuse easy solace. Hold that unease. It is the beginning of seeing. Stay with me. The ledger will not lie this time. Listen. Now that you have tasted the first wound, we move into the machinery that made it inevitable. Charleston's dignity is a stage set fastened to a ledger. Behind velvet curtains, the arithmetic of human lives is balanced with elegant calligraphy. The point is not that men were evil in isolation, but that evil was normalized by systems that taught decent people to believe their own clean hands. That is the cruel genius Solomon discovered. When cruelty wears ceremony, conscience goes to sleep. You must picture the clinics and parlors as instrument panels of governance, where conversation is the currency and ignorance the allowed theology. The doctors who tended the wealthy were not merely healers, they were custodians of social narratives. Their diagnoses provided language that reassured families and obscured patterns. A physician's pronouncement could transform an odd death into natural causes, a sudden paralysis into a tragic affliction. That rhetorical power is not incidental. It is a mechanism. Solomon watched how it was used to tidy inconvenient facts, to stitch wounds shut with euphemism. The people who sat in those parlor chairs were pillars in the public eye, ministers, merchants, planters, men who invested in reputations like other men invested in property. They understood rituals, a public act of charity, a sermon about providence, a lavish funeral. Each functioned as a gloss over the ledger's harsher entries. You might think a donation would atone, but the city had perfected another economy, reputation laundering. A gift to the church could whitewash a ledger. A name on a plaque could neutralize a memory. That architecture of forgetting is deliberate. It thrives on performative remorse and structural impunity. This is where Solomon's observation becomes your education. He was not driven only by personal anguish. He was a student of systems. He noticed patterns. Who gave time to committees and who wrote checks for expediency, who chaired benevolent societies and who quietly financed traders, who spoke vigorously about family while signing papers that dissolved them. He learned the grammar of plausible deniability and read the punctuation marks of self-justification, the unfortunate necessity, the economic reality. These were not accidental phrases. They were institutional alibis. Think about the psychology at work. When cruelty is routinized, moral imagination atrophies. People who participate in it do not feel like perpetrators. They feel like functionaries. They are taught to believe that if their actions are framed as duty, they are absolved. Solomon recognized that and understood how to expose it, by turning routines into revelation. Not through spectacle, but by letting reparations of truth accumulate until there was no longer a place to hide behind ritual. Listen to the cadence of his journal here. The entries are not rants. They are case studies. He records names, dates, habits, details that look mundane but together form an indictment. The language is clinical because he learned to speak the language of those he observed. By matching their diction, he made his testimony almost impossible to dismiss as hysteria. He became a mirror held to the city's face, reflecting a pattern its citizens preferred to ignore. This is where the moral complexity thickens. You will find no cartoon villainy in Solomon's notes. He does not demonize individuals so much as reveal the scaffolding that allows them to sleep at night. Their humanity is not erased, it is implicated. The force of the story comes from recognizing that ordinary men, men who prayed, who taught, who mentored, could also be architects of atrocity when systems reward erasure. That recognition is the sharp edge of this section. Complicity is not always loud. Often it is polite. Now the descent sharpens. You have seen the costume, you have felt the stagecraft of Charleston's illusions, but what happens when a man, broken in the most intimate way, refuses to let those illusions stand unchallenged? This is the marrow of Solomon's journal. Not a manual of punishment, but a philosophy of transformation. He begins to write as if addressing the future, not just cataloguing his grief, but shaping it into something that could outlive him. Solomon was not loud. His power was in patience. Patience, the discipline his oppressors mistook for submission. They believed his silence meant acceptance, but it was a silence filled with arithmetic. He was weighing faces against names, names against deeds, and deeds against the weight of his children's absence. He measured how much a society could forget and how much he could remember. This was his weapon, memory sharpened into intention. In the practice on Meeting Street, Solomon learned how routine could blind. He watched patients arrive, their suffering cushioned by wealth, their faith placed in the same hands that profited from dismantling lives. They spoke of symptoms, not sins. They complained of aches, never of the cries from the auction block outside their windows. Their conversations overheard while tinctures were prepared revealed patterns. They traded gossip about trade routes and debts, about the weather and rice yields, but never about the lives broken to sustain them. That silence was their true language, the silence of power that chooses what not to see. Solomon listened with the ears of a man whose family had been erased, and he wrote it all down. The journal's middle entries read like anatomy notes, except the body under examination was not a patient, but a city. He dissected Charleston as a physician dissects flesh, carefully, layer by layer, exposing nerves that twitched under pressure. H. He detailed which men signed which papers, who guaranteed whose loans, who laughed too loudly at the auction house. His scalpel was ink, and his autopsy was aimed at the conscience of posterity. Understand the weight of this transformation. For years Solomon had healed. He had poured remedies into wounds, coaxed fevers to break, soothed pain with herbs carried in memory from his ancestors. Healing was his inheritance, his identity. To turn that inheritance toward anything else was to fracture his very soul. But grief does not always destroy. Sometimes it inverts. He became the same careful practitioner, but now his diagnosis was of corruption, his treatment plan, exposure. He wrote not to comfort, but to confront. And here, my listener, is where the story turns toward you, because the journal is not only a record of Charleston in the 1850s, it is a mirror for any society that launders cruelty through ritual. Solomon forces the reader, you, to ask, what are the silences that keep your world intact? Who profits from those silences? And when you see them, what will you do with that knowledge? At this point in the descent, Solomon's voice shifts again. His words take on a new cadence, almost like scripture, the scripture of the betrayed. He no longer pleads, he no longer mourns, he declares. His lines are not about personal revenge, but about collective blindness. He sees himself as a witness history did not want, a chronicler of truths that official records would scrub away. In that role, he becomes more than a man. He becomes a cipher for every broken family, every silenced name. This is why the story is dangerous, because once you have heard it, you cannot return to innocence. You cannot pretend you did not glimpse the ledger behind the curtain. Solomon's journal demands your complicity or your courage. It does not allow neutrality. That is why, even now, the CI. Ty tried to bury it under magnolia roots, because a ledger exposed is an empire trembling. So I ask you now, as Solomon's words once asked of him, what will you do with the silence you inherit? To ignore it is to join those who laughed at the market. To acknowledge it is to step into witness. And witness, my friend, is a form of power that cannot be revoked. The descent is not over. The next section will take you from observation into intention, where patience crystallizes into a plan, not in recipes of harm, but in a vision of how one man sought to make the city choke on its own forgetting. The rabbit hole deepens, the ledger bleeds. Stay with me. This is where the air grows thinner. Observation alone cannot sustain a man whose blood hums with grief. Solomon had filled pages with anatomy of a city, with dissections of its rituals, with an archive of silences. But memory alone was not enough. Memory must eventually press against action, or else it curdles into despair. What emerges here is not a handbook of retaliation, but a philosophy of reckoning. How to make a city choke on the very smoke it used to hide its sins. Do not imagine an uprising with torches and blades. That is too crude, too visible. Charleston was fortified against fire, rebellion, rumor. The powerful expected open revolt and knew how to crush it. What they did not expect was erosion, slow, invisible, inevitable. Solomon understood this. He had seen how disease worked, unseen at first, creeping into marrow, spreading until even the strongest body faltered. He decided to treat Charleston as he would a patient, by finding its hidden fevers and refusing to let them remain unseen. The journal shifts tone here. No longer just notes, no longer only witness. The words sharpen into intention. He writes about leverage, not muscle, but memory, not rage, but precision. He lists names alongside deeds, not for vengeance, but for truth. A man is undone when his own history testifies against him, one line reads. That is the core of his plan. Not to destroy with fire, but to expose with light so merciless that shadows could no longer protect. You must understand how radical this was. In a society built on curated appearances, exposure was worse than violence. Violence could be condemned, punished, erased from polite record. But exposure, that was contamination. It spread. It whispered in drawing rooms. It stained reputations. It unraveled carefully constructed myths of benevolence. To force a city to confront its own reflection was a weapon more destabilizing than blade or musket. So Solomon became a custodian of secrets. He collected overheard boasts, careless remarks, whispers traded after sermons. He remembered who smirked when families were divided, who purchased children as though they were trinkets, who signed the bills of sale that traveled in sealed envelopes. He wove them into his journal like threads into a tapestry, but he did not simply catalogue. He cross-referenced, he aligned patterns, he drew lines between charity and cruelty, sermon and purchase. He showed how the same hand could write scripture in the morning and slave contracts in the evening. It was not revenge he prepared, it was indictment, a living indictment that, once unveiled, would leave no respectable man unmarked. His intention was to craft a testimony so thorough, so undeniable, that even centuries later it could not be dismissed as rumor. That is why, my listener, the journal reads like scripture and diagnosis both. It was meant to outlast his body. Pause here and breathe. This is the pivot point. You have followed grief into witness, witness into analysis, analysis into intention. The next step is dangerous because intention must eventually confront power. That confrontation will not look like you expect. There will be no battlefield, no bloodied banner. Instead, there will be rooms filled with silence so heavy it cracks the walls of Charleston's gentility. Remember, Solomon's power was not the shout, but the whisper that would not fade. He chose erosion over explosion, clarity over carnage. His lesson for you and me is this: some battles are won not by striking, but by recording so carefully that forgetting becomes impossible. The descent is not finished. Section 5 will lead you into the unveiling, the moment when intention seeks audience, when Solomon begins to turn his private ledger outward, and when the city that buried truth will find truth clawing its way back through the soil. The rabbit hole narrows, the walls lean closer. Stay with me. Now lean closer, because the air in this chamber grows heavy. You have walked with Solomon through grief, through witness, through the calculus of intention. But an intention unspoken is only a shadow. The journal now begins to press outward, scratching against the edges of secrecy, yearning to be heard beyond candlelight. This is the unveiling, not yet complete but inevitable, like thunder rolling toward a city that still pretends the sky is clear. Solomon knew his words could not remain his alone. A ledger kept in a locked drawer is safe, but safety was never his purpose. He had learned from the very men he despised. They wielded records as weapons, deeds, contracts, inventories. Ink could sanctify theft. If ink could sanctify, ink could also indict. What they had used to enslave, he would use to expose. That symmetry was his genius. But how does a man without power let his words breathe? He began cautiously. He left fragments in places where eyes might stumble upon them. A line folded into the binding of an old medical text, a phrase scrawled on the reverse of a discarded prescription, a name slipped into the margin of a sermon draft left unattended. He trusted the city's arrogance, that no one of rank would suspect the quiet hand that moved beneath their papers. He planted his words like seeds, knowing some would be swept away, but some might root. The journal records not only what he wrote, but how he imagined his words would travel. Let them find themselves staring back at themselves, he wrote. Let them choke on the reflection. His unveiling was not a performance, it was an infection. He wanted whispers to circulate, not shouts. A whisper travels further because it invites repetition. Each man, uncertain if the rumor is known more widely, repeats it in hushed tones. The city that thrived on silence would now be undone by murmurs too persistent to contain. What makes this moment dangerous, my listener, is that Solomon's unveiling was never about spectacle. It was about corrosion. He understood that a single violent act could be suppressed, rewritten, forgotten. But words, precise, undeniable, etched into memory, were harder to bury. A city can burn and rebuild. A city confronted with its own hidden reflection cannot return to innocence. And so the ledger became a mirror. Solomon began writing less like a chronicler and more like an accuser. He did not name himself in these passages. Instead, he let the facts speak as though written by the city itself. That was his strategy, to erase his hand, to make exposure appear inevitable, as if the truth itself had grown impatient and clawed its way into daylight. Imagine the unease in Charleston's parlors when such fragments surfaced. A minister preparing a sermon notices a name, his own, inked faintly beside a list of auction dates. A merchant finds a scrap in his ledger drawer, a line that connects his profit to a child's sale. These discoveries are never public, but they ripple through private consciences, and that is precisely where Solomon aimed. He knew public reputation mattered more than private morality, and by shaking the former he forced the latter to tremble. Pause here and feel the tension. The unveiling is not an explosion. It is a tightening coil, a gathering storm, a slow suffocation of Charleston's curated silence. You, as reader, are no longer outside this. The journal insists that witnessing is participation. To hear these words is to become part of the unveiling. You carry them now whether you wish to or not. And so we stand at the threshold. What comes next is not simply revelation but confrontation. The point where whispers refuse to remain whispers, where the city feels its mask begin to crack. Section 6 will lead you into that trembling moment where the ledger's hidden voice collides with power itself, and where Solomon's patience begins to reshape history's marrow. Charleston, 1852. The city wore its grandeur like a mask of ivory and silk, but Solomon's ledger was already gnawing beneath that mask, loosening the ties, preparing to rip it away. By day, the elite still dined beneath chandeliers, recited scripture with practiced solemnity, and toasted fortunes built on the backs of men in chains. But by night, certain households found themselves sleepless, hearts pounding at the discovery of a single slip of paper, a line of ink that should never have existed. Imagine the terror of seeing your private guilt recorded by an unseen hand. Colonel Fitzpatrick, whose jests about children on the auction block still stained the air, opened his medical satchel one evening to find a folded scrap in Solomon's hand. You laughed while they wept. Laughter will be your coffin's song. No one had seen it placed there. No servant confessed. Yet there it was, undeniable, undeniable. He burned the slip, but the words did not vanish. They engraved themselves in his memory, crawling back in his dreams. This was Solomon's brilliance. The paralysis began long before the toxin ever touched a vein. Psychological venom seeped into the city's ruling class, each man imagining unseen eyes upon him, each man hearing phantom footsteps behind him in the darkened streets. Fear became their shadow, and shadows obeyed Solomon. But he did not rush. He knew fear sharpens when stretched over time. He allowed the unease to spread, each fragment of the journal placed with surgical precision, and Charleston, proud Charleston, began to quiver. Ministers cut sermons short, merchants kept ledgers locked, plantation lords avoided solitude. Their confidence was cracking, though they would never admit it aloud. Still, the unveiling demanded more. A whisper corrodes, yes, but confrontation shatters. Solomon understood this stage of his campaign required spectacle, not for the crowd, but for the chosen few who must feel their world tilt. He chose his battleground with care. A dinner party on King Street, hosted by Judge Harrington, one of Charleston's most powerful men and a purchaser of slaves from the very auction that destroyed Solomon's family. The city's titans gathered there, wine, roast pheasant, and lies disguised as civility. Among them, 3 of Solomon's marked names. He entered only as a servant, pouring wine, clearing dishes, invisible as always. But invisibility is the perfect vantage point for unveiling. The moment came with dessert. As Judge Harrington raised his glass to toast the eternal prosperity of Charleston, the candlelight flickered, and one of the guests, the merchant Caleb Dwyer, unfolded his napkin to find words inked across the linen itself. Prosperity written in blood does not endure. 9 graves are waiting. The room froze. Forks halted mid-air, faces drained of color. No one spoke, but every man present felt the chill run down his spine. Where had the words come from? How could ink appear on linen at the very table? They glanced toward the servant Solomon, but dismissed the thought. He stood calm, silent, his eyes lowered. The mask of obedience remained flawless, yet the seed had been planted. They were being watched. They were not untouchable. This confrontation was not physical, it was metaphysical. It was the shattering of their illusion of safety. Solomon's unveiling had leapt from whispers in dark corners to the heart of Charleston's power, and the city, though still laughing in the daylight, had begun to tremble in the marrow of night. Understand this, my listener. Men fear death, but they fear exposure even more. And Solomon, the healer turned executioner, had mastered both. What came next was no longer preparation, it was execution. Section 7 will draw you into the first descent, the night Solomon crossed from whisper to strike, when vengeance took its first breath in the lungs of the guilty. The first strike had to be flawless. A single misstep, and the entire edifice of vengeance would collapse. Solomon knew this. He had studied the 9 names as though they were patients, each man diagnosed with a terminal condition whose cure would never arrive. Their disease was power, their medicine would be fear, their ending would be burial in silence, clawing at coffins they thought were beds of honor. The chosen beginning was Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick, wealthy rice planter, auction jester, man whose cruelty carried the stench of arrogance so thick it lingered even after he left a room. Fitzpatrick suffered from gout, a condition that brought him to Dr. Hathaway's office with predictable regularity. He trusted Solomon's hands, the cool compresses, the tinctures prepared with care. That trust would become the blade that slit his soul. On a humid evening in late June 1852, Fitzpatrick arrived alone, as he often did, grumbling about the pain gnawing at his feet. The office smelled faintly of camphor and spirits, but beneath those scents lay something more sinister, the invisible trace of a paralytic compound Solomon had spent months perfecting. Tonight the experiment would no longer be in glass vials. Tonight it would live inside a man. The colonel laughed coarsely as Solomon applied a salve. "You'd be nothing without this city's mercy," he sneered, sipping the cordial Solomon had poured for him. He had no idea that within 30 minutes his legs would betray him, his chest would stiffen, and his tongue would weigh like stone in his mouth. Solomon listened, nodded, patient. Every insult was another nail in the coffin that waited. And then it began. Fitzpatrick faltered mid-sentence, blinking rapidly. His words slurred. His glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. He clutched at his chest, eyes wide, searching Solomon's face for answers. Solomon met his gaze with the calm of a physician, but there was no remedy tonight, only revelation. "You are not dying," Solomon whispered, though his voice was so soft only Fitzpatrick could hear. "You are awake. You will remain awake, but your body no longer belongs to you." The colonel's eyes bulged, panic clawing inside him. He tried to move, to shout, but nothing obeyed. He was a prisoner inside his own flesh, consciousness intact, body frozen. Solomon carefully lowered him onto the examination table, arranging him like a patient in repose. The appearance was of sudden collapse, of natural failure, but the truth was a performance, one designed to end beneath the soil. That night, Fitzpatrick's family was summoned. The diagnosis was swift: apoplexy, paralysis, inevitable death. Dr. Hathaway, unsuspecting, signed the papers. Within 24 hours, the colonel was laid in his coffin, his body dressed in finery, his face painted with the peace of false slumber. None noticed the faint tremor in his eye, the desperate flicker of awareness trapped inside. And then came the burial. 6 feet of soil pressed above him, darkness suffocating, lungs heaving against a coffin that would never yield. The scratch marks Solomon would one day describe began that night, tearing into the wood, muffled screams absorbed by dirt. Fitzpatrick had become the first of 9, a man who thought himself untouchable, now devoured by the silence he had mocked. Solomon did not rejoice. He recorded. In his journal that night he wrote, "The first root has taken hold. The tree of justice will grow tall. He felt the helplessness of my children. He begged for breath as they once begged for mercy. Now the earth keeps him." Understand this. Vengeance is not fury. Fury burns quickly. Vengeance is discipline, patience, precision. With Fitzpatrick's burial, Solomon crossed the threshold. There was no return, no forgiveness, no compromise. 1 name had been erased. 8 remained. Charleston did not mourn Colonel Fitzpatrick with sincerity. They mourned him with spectacle. Carriages lined Meeting Street, silk dresses swished through the churchyard, and voices muttered polite grief while eyes glittered with calculation. A planter had fallen, but not the system. Men like Fitzpatrick were interchangeable, until the whispers began. The first cracks appeared at the burial itself. A gravedigger swore he heard faint scratching as the coffin was lowered, a sound too sharp for coincidence. He told another worker, and by dusk, half the cemetery staff had heard the rumor. The overseer silenced them with threats, but the whisper did not die. It slithered into taverns, down alleys, across markets. Fitzpatrick clawed the box, some said. The devil carried him alive into the dirt. Others nodded solemnly, as though they already knew Charleston was cursed. Solomon fed the fire, not openly, never openly, but with careful sparks. A word dropped into a servant's ear, a phrase etched into the back of a discarded prescription. The coffin breathes. Fear is fertile soil. By the end of July, Charleston's elite were speaking in hushed tones, asking themselves questions they could not voice publicly. What if Fitzpatrick had not died cleanly? What if something unnatural had taken him? What if someone was watching? The beauty of fear is that it multiplies without proof. One death became an omen. One whisper became prophecy. Solomon understood that the human mind does not need certainty, it only needs suggestion, and suggestion is a toxin deadlier than any compound. But vengeance was not only about individual men, it was about the institution they embodied. Fitzpatrick's death sent ripples into the entire network of Charleston's slaveocracy. Judges, merchants, ministers, men who had once spoken with arrogance now spoke cautiously, glancing over shoulders, their bravado eroded by doubt. A city thrives on confidence. Strip that away, and even stone buildings tremble. In his journal, Solomon recorded their decline with the precision of a physician documenting symptoms. The patient, he wrote, exhibits signs of unease, eyes dart, hands tremble at the table. They toast prosperity, but the glass shakes before lips. Diagnosis, approaching collapse. But fear alone was not enough. Fear had to escalate, to spread beyond rumor into a rhythm of inevitability. One death could be chance. 2 deaths, then 3, would become a pattern, and patterns are impossible to ignore. Solomon knew his next move must fall swiftly before the city convinced itself that Fitzpatrick's fate was an accident. So he turned his gaze upon the merchant Caleb Dwyer, the very man who had found words inked upon his dinner napkin. Dwyer was younger than Fitzpatrick, but his cruelty wore a different mask. Charm. He smiled as he sold. He laughed as he signed contracts. He spoke of God's will as he shattered families for profit. To the city he was respectable. To Solomon he was next. But understand this, Solomon was not careless. Each step required calculation. Dwyer's end would not mirror Fitzpatrick's. It had to evolve, to suggest an intelligence orchestrating these deaths. The toxin would be refined, the unveiling more dramatic. Every escalation fed the legend, and the legend was as lethal as the compound itself. Now pause, my listener. Feel the shift. One man is buried, clawing at his coffin. Another lies still, but the shadow of his fate already leans over his shoulder. The city senses it, though it dares not name it. And you are no longer a mere spectator. By hearing these words, you walk Solomon's path, step by step, deeper into the forbidden. Section 9 will take you into the second strike, the unraveling of Caleb Dwyer and how Solomon transformed fear from rumor into revelation. Caleb Dwyer was not a man accustomed to fear. He wore confidence like a second skin, the kind of man who shook hands too firmly, who laughed too loudly, who always ensured the final word at any table belonged to him. Yet beneath that charm lay rot. He had purchased children as easily as cattle, spoken of inventory instead of lives, and cloaked his cruelty with scripture. He was Charleston's smiling serpent. Solomon watched him carefully, not through anger, but through the cold patience of a hunter studying prey. Fitzpatrick had been the test, the proof of method. Dwyer would be the confirmation, the strike that transformed whispers into certainty. If Fitzpatrick's fate had unsettled Charleston, Dwyer's would unmask the city's fear in broad daylight. The opportunity came in August of 1852. Dwyer suffered from recurring stomach ailments, an affliction brought on by indulgence and wine, though he called it the humours. He was a frequent visitor to Dr. Hathaway's practice, trusting Solomon's tonics to ease the cramping that followed his feasts. Trust is a fragile thing. Place poison in its cup, and trust becomes a noose. On the evening of August 19th, Dwyer arrived late, complaining of pain, demanding relief. Solomon received him with the same calm deference as always. He prepared a cordial, blending herbs with a clear liquid so subtle, so precise, that no eye could detect it. Dwyer drank greedily, muttering thanks, never once suspecting the hands that served him were also his executioners. Within half an hour the symptoms began, not sudden collapse as with Fitzpatrick. This was different. Solomon had refined the dosage, altering the compound's rhythm. Dwyer first grew flushed, then pale, sweat pouring down his brow. His hands shook violently, his voice cracked as he tried to call for aid. He stumbled, grasping at the table, his body convulsing. Dr. Hathaway, alarmed, believed it a violent seizure. Solomon played his part perfectly, assisting with feigned urgency, fetching cloths, murmuring instructions. But he knew the truth. Paralysis would follow. And it did. Dwyer's body stiffened, eyes wide, locked in terror. He was conscious, entirely conscious, yet powerless to move. Solomon leaned close, speaking words only Dwyer could hear. "This is not sickness. This is justice. Your tongue is stone, but your soul still hears. You are not dying yet. You are being prepared." That night, Dwyer succumbed to his mysterious affliction. His family wept, physicians shook their heads, and Charleston muttered about strange illnesses plaguing its elite. But at burial, whispers multiplied. The undertaker swore. Dwyer's eyes flickered even as the coffin was closed. A servant claimed she heard muffled thuds beneath the earth. None could prove it. All could fear it. 2 men now lay beneath Charleston's soil, clawing or screaming in silence, Fitzpatrick and Dwyer, pillars of wealth rotting in terror, and the city began to stitch together a pattern. This was not random. Something hunted them, something patient, deliberate, merciless. In his journal, Solomon wrote, "2 roots now grow. They will speak for me beneath the earth. Their silence is my song, their terror my scripture. I will write 9 chapters, and Charleston will read them whether it wishes or not." Do you feel it, listener? The tightening spiral. Each strike is not only vengeance, but revelation, and revelation cannot be buried. Already you know too much, you cannot unknow it. By the autumn of 1852, Charleston had become a city haunted not by ghosts, but by dread. 2 pillars of its ruling class lay beneath the soil, both buried too quickly, both surrounded by whispers that would not die. Fitzpatrick's coffin had been scratched. Dwyer's eyes, some swore, had twitched as the lid closed. Whispers swirled through parlours and taverns, spoken in half-words, unfinished sentences. No one dared to say it aloud, but all felt the shadow pressing closer. Paranoia does not arrive with thunder. It creeps. It begins in sleepless nights, in the rustle of curtains mistaken for footsteps, in the imagined weight of eyes that may or may not be watching. Charleston's elite, men who had once strutted through streets with the confidence of gods, now found themselves avoiding solitude, jumping at shadows, clutching cups of wine with trembling hands. And Solomon fed it, not recklessly, but surgically. He knew that fear magnified when men doubted themselves. He left no proof, only suggestions. A ledger page rearranged, a servant's testimony whispered and then withdrawn, a candle extinguished in a hallway just as a man passed. Little things, imperceptible to outsiders, but enough to rot a man's certainty from the inside out. One merchant, Henry Alcott, swore he awoke one night to the sound of scratching from beneath his floorboards. He tore up planks in the morning, finding nothing but soil. Another, Judge Harrington, claimed he discovered ink stains on his own hands. Despite never holding a quill that evening, he scrubbed them raw until they bled. No one believed them, not truly, but their terror infected others. Solomon had turned the entire city into his patient. The disease was paranoia, and he prescribed it liberally. And the beauty of it was this: he didn't need to touch every man, he only needed to touch a few, and the infection would spread itself. Fear is contagious. But paranoia has a second, darker function. It erodes loyalty. Men who once dined together, laughed together, profited together, now eyed each other with suspicion. They began asking dangerous questions. Who benefits from these deaths? Who might be next? Which among us carries guilt that makes him vulnerable? The solidarity of power cracked, and through those cracks, Solomon poured his silence like acid. In his journal he wrote, "The city begins to devour itself. I have barely lifted a hand, yet they tear at one another with glances and half-spoken doubts. This is the true medicine, not the toxin, not the burial, but the seed of suspicion that blossoms without tending." Understand this, my listener: fear of death weakens the body, but fear of exposure corrodes the soul. These men were not only terrified of coffins, they were terrified that someone, somewhere, had recorded their sins, and Solomon had. The journal was no longer a secret book. It was a weapon, sharper than any blade, heavier than any chain. By November, Charleston's ruling class lived like hunted animals in their own mansions. Servants noticed locks installed on doors never locked before. Ministers shortened their sermons. Merchants avoided traveling alone. Even the most arrogant among them, the men who once boasted of invincibility, kept lamps burning through the night. Paranoia had become policy, and that was exactly as Solomon intended. By winter of 1852, Charleston had become a theater of whispers. Fear clung to the cobblestones, seeped through the shutters of great houses, lingered in the pews of churches where once only piety had ruled. 2 burials had passed, yet no one dared call them natural. Men who had traded in flesh their whole lives now felt their own bodies betray them, palms damp, hearts racing at shadows. And through it all, Solomon moved unseen, quiet as breath, steady as the ticking of a clock counting down to judgment. But vengeance must have rhythm. 1 strike could be called chance, 2, misfortune. The third would be a pattern carved into the marrow of Charleston itself. The city needed to see that a hand was guiding these fates, deliberate and merciless. Solomon understood this truth, and so his gaze fell upon Reverend Josiah Cartwright. Cartwright was no mere hypocrite. He was hypocrisy given flesh. He preached mercy from the pulpit and ordered the whipping of bondsmen before his Sunday dinner. He spoke of Christ's love while profiting from auctions that tore children from mothers. Worse, he dressed his cruelty in scripture, convincing the flock that chains were divine order. To Solomon, Cartwright was not only guilty, he was poison. The Reverend's habits were known. Every Thursday evening he hosted a private supper with fellow ministers where wine flowed and laughter echoed louder than prayers. He trusted his servants to prepare the table, his guests to confirm his sanctity, his God to forgive what man dared not question. Solomon would not forgive, Solomon would unveil. The strike unfolded not with a cup, but with a book. Into Cartwright's study, Solomon slipped a single page of his journal, folded neatly inside the Reverend's Bible. It bore no accusation, only a verse rewritten. "The shepherd who fattens on his flock shall lie among the wolves. His voice will cry in silence, beneath the earth." The Reverend discovered it the following morning during his devotions. Witnesses swore his hand trembled so violently he dropped the holy book. He dismissed it as a prank, but his confidence cracked. By evening he drank heavily, his laughter forced, his eyes darting toward shadows. The poison came later, woven into his communion wine, a place he believed untouchable, sanctified. Solomon had measured it carefully, not swift, not loud, but creeping. During supper, as ministers debated scripture, Cartwright's tongue thickened, his hands shook, the chalice slipping from his grasp. He collapsed in mid-prayer, his voice seizing in his throat. The room erupted. Ministers rushed to his side, servants fetched cloths, someone cried for a physician. But by the time help arrived, Cartwright was paralyzed, his eyes fixed, his lips parted in what seemed a holy trance. They said he passed into the arms of God, taken by sudden affliction. But Solomon knew better. Cartwright was alive, fully aware, trapped within a vessel that no longer obeyed him. Within a day, he too lay in a coffin, dressed in robes of sanctity, hymns sung over his breathless form. Yet beneath the soil, another sermon began. The scratching of nails, the muffled cries of a preacher begging for mercy in the dark he once condemned others to. Charleston erupted. 3 men, powerful, untouchable, gone in a matter of months. The taverns muttered of curses, the churches spoke of divine judgment, the slaves whispered of justice rising from the earth itself. The legend began to spread. There was a man burying masters alive. Some called him Death's physician, others the silent avenger. No one named Solomon, not yet. In his journal he wrote, "The third root binds the tree, now they know it grows. Each coffin is a verse, each grave a chapter. I do not write alone, the earth writes with me." By the start of 1853, Charleston was a city with trembling hands. The streets bustled as always, markets rang with voices, the harbour swelled with trade, but beneath that surface beat a heart riddled with fear. 3 coffins had been lowered, 3 men of power sealed into the earth, and none could escape the sense that more graves waited, already dug in silence. The ruling class tried to explain it away. Doctors spoke of new fevers, ministers claimed divine judgment, merchants muttered of bad air drifting from the marshes. But explanations are weak when the pattern is undeniable. These were not random men, they were not poor, they were not powerless, they were Charleston's masters, and something was hunting them. Paranoia grew into fever. Families began refusing to eat at public gatherings. Wine went untasted at banquets. Communion chalices sat untouched, their silver shining mockingly under candlelight. Servants whispered that their masters now prayed alone in locked rooms, pacing until dawn, afraid to sleep. Even laughter, once the proud echo of Charleston's aristocracy, became brittle, breaking too quickly into silence. And through it all, Solomon moved among them, unseen. A bow of the head here, a careful hand delivering a vial there. No one saw the storm inside his eyes. They could not imagine that the quiet apothecary who prepared their medicines was also preparing their graves. Yet the fear was no longer confined to the masters. It spread into the city's very air. Dockworkers spoke of seeing shadows that vanished when followed. Children dared each other to walk past the graveyard after dark, swearing they heard muffled cries beneath the earth. Enslaved men and women whispered of justice taking form, that the soil itself had risen to avenge them. For the first time, Charleston's walls carried not only the weight of chains, but the breath of rebellion. Solomon, his journal for February, bore a single line, "Fear has become my accomplice." It was true. He no longer needed to place scraps of writing in pockets or books. The city itself had become his scripture. Rumors did his work for him, spreading faster than any hand could carry ink. Each whisper was a seed, and the city had become fertile soil. But chaos, if left untended, can turn wild. Solomon knew he must direct it, shape it, bend it toward his design. He did not want riots, not yet. He wanted precision, the steady rhythm of burials, the tightening of a noose that choked slowly, deliberately. Panic was useful, but only when it obeyed. So he began to plan his 4th descent. A man of law this time, Judge Harrington, the host of that cursed dinner where Solomon had first etched terror into linen. Harrington represented the face of order, the illusion that Charleston's cruelty was sanctioned by divine and legal decree. To strike him would be to shake the very foundation of the city's false justice. Already Harrington had grown pale and thin, his once booming voice reduced to a nervous rasp. He locked his doors at night, posted guards, refused to eat food he had not watched prepared. But no lock holds back the soil, no guard keeps out the silent hand. Solomon wrote in his ledger, "Fear fattens him. Soon the earth will claim its 4th verse." Charleston braced, though none admitted it aloud. The fever of dread had settled into its bones. They knew another coffin was coming. They just did not know whose name was already written on the lid. Judge Harrington sat in his parlor as though the very walls conspired against him. Once a man who thundered from the bench with booming certainty, he now sat trembling in silence, clutching a glass of brandy that did nothing to still his shaking hands. His mansion, draped in velvet and adorned with portraits of ancestors who had also ruled from Charleston's courts, felt less like a home and more like a tomb. He had heard the whispers that 3 of his peers had gone into the ground, clawing, suffocating, screaming against the soil. He wondered, each time he closed his eyes, if he would be next. The irony was cruel. Harrington had once presided over the trial of a slave accused of poisoning his master. The man had been convicted with little evidence, executed within days, his body strung from an oak to remind others of the cost of rebellion. Harrington had smiled coldly as he gave the sentence. To him, law was a weapon, a whip made of words, dressed in robes and sanctified by scripture. And yet now, as the walls seemed to breathe around him, he wondered if the law could save him from a hand more silent, more patient, and infinitely more merciless. That hand was already moving. Solomon had chosen Harrington not only for his role in upholding Charleston's cruelty, but because the man represented the illusion of order itself. To strike a judge was to strike the mask of justice, to show the people, enslaved and free alike, that the law was nothing but a costume draped over corruption. Solomon's method was precise. Harrington suffered from gout, like many of his wealthy peers. He required regular mixtures to dull the pain and aid his swelling joints. It was through these mixtures that Solomon would work, blending his paralytic toxin into the powders and tinctures that Harrington trusted implicitly. Trust, that fatal crack in every man's armor. When Harrington's servant brought the medicine to him, the judge sneered, but he drank. He believed in the safety of ritual. He believed in the shield of wealth. He believed in the illusion that death would pass him by because he was the one who commanded it from the bench. But belief, as Solomon had learned, is the weakest defense. The toxin worked slowly, like a serpent coiling around its prey. Harrington first felt it in his legs. An ache beyond gout, a weight pulling him down as though the earth itself demanded his surrender. Within hours, his arms refused him. By evening, he collapsed upon his bed, eyes wide, lips trembling, body rigid as the paralysis took hold. He tried to shout for his servants, but no words came. Only shallow gasps, only terror in his gaze. And when the undertakers came, summoned by family who thought the judge had finally succumbed to his ailments, they did not know the truth. They saw stillness and assumed silence. They saw the shell and assumed death. But Harrington's eyes, oh his eyes, darted frantically as he was lowered into the coffin. His mind screamed against the suffocating black. His fingernails tore into wood until blood slicked the lid, and the soil pressed down, and the air thinned, and the illusion of law was buried alive. When the funeral bells rang over Charleston, something broke in the city. A judge, a pillar of the law, had been swallowed by the same unseen terror that had already claimed 3 others. The courts fell into disarray, their sessions hushed, their benches empty. Merchants refused to sign contracts without triple witnesses. Ministers thundered about demons rising from the earth, and the people, the enslaved who watched quietly from the shadows, began to whisper louder. For them it was not demons, it was justice. Justice moving in silence, justice that no chain could hold, justice that buried masters alive while leaving their wealth theirs, their titles, their power, useless. And Solomon, writing by candlelight that night, etched one line into his journal. The law has been tried and found guilty. Sentence. The soil. Charleston had always prided itself on being a city of elegance, refinement, and order. Its mansions rose like marble fortresses, its courts spoke with the authority of kings, and its merchants boasted that wealth would forever insulate them from ruin. But after Judge Harrington's burial, the illusion shattered. The fear that once clung to private whispers now bled into the streets. The city itself felt haunted by its own conscience, by the shadows of 9 graves already being dug in silence. Slaves moved quietly through the markets, carrying goods, hauling barrels, serving tables, but their eyes told another story. They had seen their masters pale with terror. They had overheard midnight arguments between men who once bragged of power, but now trembled at every creak in the floorboards. For the first time, those enslaved understood a truth more intoxicating than freedom itself. Their oppressors were afraid. Fear is contagious. It seeps into walls, into the marrow of a city. Even the children of Charleston sensed it. They whispered to each other that their fathers would be taken next, that shadows beneath their beds belonged not to nightmares, but to the avenger who walked in daylight with quiet eyes. Mothers hushed them, but even they glanced nervously toward the cemetery at night, where the soil seemed to sigh with restless hunger, and while the city tried to hide its terror behind closed doors, Solomon nurtured it like a gardener tending fire. He knew the psychology of fear better than any physician knew the body. Fear, when scattered, created panic, but fear, when shaped, became a weapon sharper than any blade. He let it grow, but guided its growth, ensuring that each death, each burial, was not random chaos, but deliberate rhythm, a cadence of terror that Charleston could not ignore. His journal for March read, 4 into the earth, 5 remain, the city quakes. Before the storm, yet does not see the hand that guides the lightning. Fear must not scatter, it must harden into truth. But something else was happening, something Solomon had not expected. Among the enslaved, whispers became songs of resistance. Not open rebellion, not yet, but a current moving beneath the surface. Men sang by the fires at night of a shadow with healing hands that turned graves into justice. Women told their children that the spirits of the dead had risen to fight for them. Hope, once dangerous, now felt alive. And hope is the most forbidden thing of all. Charleston's masters sensed it. They noticed the shift in posture, the subtle boldness in the gaze of men who had once been taught to lower their eyes. They heard the murmur of hymns sung with new fire. It frightened them more than the coffins, for if Solomon's vengeance planted fear in their hearts, it planted courage in the enslaved, and courage spreads faster than terror. The elite grew desperate. They doubled their guards. They banned gatherings of slaves after dark. Ministers preached sermons warning against satanic influences corrupting the lower classes, yet every decree only revealed their trembling hands more clearly. Power that must shout to assert itself is already slipping away. And Solomon? He walked the city like a ghost cloaked in flesh, the same quiet assistant they had always trusted, the healer who prepared their medicines, the servant who bowed at their tables. None dared suspect that he was the author of their nightmares. His revenge was no longer his alone. It had become a mirror held to Charleston's soul, forcing it to confront the truth it had buried for centuries, that power built on chains is power built on sand. In his journal, beneath the names of his next 2 targets, Solomon wrote only one phrase: "The soil is not yet satisfied." By spring of 1853, Charleston was a city on edge, and Solomon knew the timing was perfect. 4 men of power had already been swallowed by the earth, their bodies clawing against coffins that doubled as confessionals. But revenge is not merely arithmetic, it is theater. Each act must intensify, each burial more symbolic than the last, until the city itself feels as though it is sinking into the soil. The 5th man would be chosen not simply for guilt, but for spectacle. His name was Elias Thornwell, a shipping magnate whose fortune had been built on human cargo. Thornwell was not a plantation owner, but something worse, a trafficker of flesh, a man whose ships carried shackled bodies from one coast to another, tearing families apart like livestock at auction. He prided himself on efficiency, boasting that no merchant in Charleston could pack the human hold tighter than he. Thornwell was a man of immense influence. His home overlooked the harbor, his ships lined the docks like an iron fleet, and his voice carried weight in Charleston's highest councils. Striking him would not merely silence a profiteer, it would send a message carved in thunder that no fortress of wealth could shield the guilty from the hand of justice. Solomon's method was daring, more dangerous than any attempt before. Thornwell was surrounded by guards and servants, his meals carefully prepared, his movements calculated with military precision. Yet men like Thornwell have one weakness: vanity. He suffered from a lingering cough, a weakness in the lungs that embarrassed him, for it interrupted his grand speeches at public gatherings, and for this he turned to Dr. Hathaway's practice. The visits were rare, but Solomon had waited for over a year with patience sharpened into a blade. He knew that when Thornwell returned for treatment, the soil would open its mouth, and so it did, on a grey afternoon. As the harbour winds carried the smell of salt and iron chains, Thornwell arrived at the practice, demanding medicine to clear his chest before a merchant council meeting. The toxin had been refined further by then. Solomon no longer relied only on paralysis. He crafted doses that mimicked consumption, a slow, wasting disease. To the eye, Thornwell would seem merely sick. To the grave, however, he would be fully awake. Solomon mixed the tincture into a cordial, presenting it with a bow so humble that Thornwell barely glanced at him. The man drank greedily, dismissing Solomon with a wave as though he were no more significant than a chair in the room. The toxin worked beautifully. Thornwell collapsed that evening, gasping for breath, his family summoning doctors who found nothing but the progression of a disease they could not halt. Within days, his body was declared lifeless, but his mind screamed as he was placed in silk-lined wood, lowered into a grave that waited like a mouth in the earth. His fingernails would carve Thornwell's confession into the coffin lid as surely as any pen might etch it on parchment. When word spread that Elias Thornwell, the iron merchant of Charleston, the man who trafficked souls, had been taken, the city convulsed. 5 now. 5 pillars toppled, 5 coffins buried, 5 families struck silent. Merchants panicked, investors fled, and whispers curled through the streets like smoke. The ships are cursed, the soil remembers. And beneath the terror of the masters, another current swelled stronger. Among the enslaved, Thornwell's death was not seen as illness, but as omen. Men working the docks looked at the empty ships and smiled faintly to themselves. Women selling goods in the market spoke of the justice that rides the wind. Children learned new words for hope, hidden in songs that carried their truth. Solomon, sitting by candlelight, marked Thornwell's name with an X in his journal. Beneath it he wrote, 5 into the soil. The balance tips. The city begins to shake. Charleston had not yet collapsed, but the cracks in its marble facade widened with each burial, and Solomon was not finished. Not yet. By the time Elias Thornwell's coffin had been sealed beneath the earth, Charleston was a city gnawing on its own nerves. 5 men, each powerful, each untouchable, now rotted in silence. And yet, it wasn't just death that haunted the city, it was how they died. The whispers of claw marks, twisted bodies, screams beneath the soil, those whispers spread faster than fire in summer fields. Even the bravest no longer dared to speak loudly in the night. For the enslaved, though, these whispers carried a different weight. To them, Solomon was no longer just a man. He was becoming a legend, a shadow wrapped in flesh, a force that moved like smoke through the city. Some called him the hand of the soil, others called him the living curse. Songs were born in hidden quarters, songs too dangerous to sing above a whisper, but songs that carried a fire nonetheless. 9 shall fall, and the earth shall rise, they said, passing the phrase like a torch from plantation to plantation. And yet Solomon knew. Legends are dangerous. Legends can inspire, but they can also betray. If his work was to remain precise, it could not swell into chaos too quickly. The soil had an order, and he would obey it. The 6th man chosen was Reverend Josiah Blackthorne, minister of Charleston's largest church. Blackthorne was a man who wrapped cruelty in scripture. He preached obedience to masters as divine command, declaring slavery the natural order of God. He baptized children torn from their mothers and told their weeping parents that heaven would repay their faith. He offered communion to the men who trafficked flesh, washing their hands with wine and calling them clean. To Solomon, Blackthorne was not just another master. He was the voice that made chains holy, too. Bury him alive would not only strike fear into the aristocracy, it would fracture their spiritual shield, for if God's minister could be dragged screaming into the soil, then what did that say of their divine protection? The opportunity came on a Sunday morning. Blackthorne had grown weak in recent weeks, coughing during sermons, his face pale with fatigue. He attributed it to spiritual burdens, but Solomon knew better. He prepared the sacramental wine with a measured dose of his toxin. The chalice gleamed in the light, passed from hand to hand, before Blackthorne lifted it to his lips before the congregation. The effect was slow, deliberate. His voice faltered mid-sermon. His hands trembled as he clutched the pulpit. Then, with eyes wide in sudden horror, he collapsed in front of the church, an entire congregation watching their shepherd fall as though struck by lightning. Panic erupted. Some shouted of plague, others of possession, but none suspected the quiet servant who had prepared the wine. Blackthorne was declared dead by evening. His body, stiff with paralysis, was placed in a coffin draped with hymns. His funeral was massive, his congregation wailing, his peers in black robes weeping at the loss of their holy leader. Yet when the lid closed, when the soil pressed down, Blackthorn's eyes were open. He clawed, he gasped, he begged, but the earth, impartial and eternal, swallowed him as it had the rest. When news spread, Charleston quaked. 5 burials could be explained as coincidence, but a minister, God's own chosen, buried alive? That could not be ignored. The city split into factions. Some declared the devil himself walked among them. Others whispered of divine judgment, that God had finally turned his face against Charleston's sins. And among the enslaved, hope burned hotter than ever. If even the ministers fell, then the system was breaking. That knee, Solomon wrote in his journal, 6 into the earth, the voice of chains is silent, 3 remain. Charleston was unraveling, and Solomon had already chosen his next target. Charleston had grown feverish. 6 men of power lay beneath the earth, their coffins marked by claw and blood. The city no longer asked if another would fall, it asked who would be next. And whispers grew louder. 9 shall fall, and the earth shall rise. The 7th man chosen was Captain Bartholomew Rains, a militia commander. He was infamous among the enslaved, known for leading night patrols that hunted runaways with dogs and iron shackles. To strike Rains was not only revenge, it was war declared on Charleston's armed hand. Solomon knew this burial would not be quiet. It would ripple like thunder. Rains commanded respect among the elites, fear among the enslaved, and obedience among the city's guards. Taking him would not just unnerve the aristocracy, it would fracture their defenses. The opportunity came in May, when Rains fell ill with a fever contracted during one of his brutal patrols. He came to Dr. Hathaway's office, pale and sweating, demanding remedies. Solomon prepared the tincture with steady hands, offering it as though in service. Rains drank without suspicion, mocking the superstitions of slaves even as poison slid into his veins. Within hours, paralysis took him. His soldiers, confused and afraid, carried their captain's body home. By dawn, his coffin was sealed, and by dusk, his fingernails were already gouging the wood in frantic confession. When news spread that Captain Rains had been buried alive, Charleston trembled. Guards deserted their posts, merchants spoke of fleeing north, and the enslaved, hearing that the hunter himself had been hunted, lifted their heads with dangerous pride. That night, Solomon wrote in his journal, 7 into the soil. Their sword is broken. 2 remain. Charleston now stood on the brink, not just of fear, but of collapse. By the summer of 1853, Charleston was a city unraveling. 7 coffins lay buried, each carrying a man who once seemed untouchable. Markets grew quiet, trade slowed, and ships in the harbor rocked listlessly as if waiting for storms no one could name. The whispers of 9 shall fall had grown into something larger, an expectation, a prophecy that every heart, enslaved or free, now believed in. The 8th man was Senator William Ashford, a statesman whose voice had carried Charleston's interest to Washington. He was not merely wealthy, he was the mouthpiece of the city's power, the man who argued slavery's righteousness in polished halls far beyond the South. To silence him would be to strike at Charleston's pride, its outward face to the world. Ashford was arrogant in his security. Unlike others, he mocked the fear sweeping Charleston, dismissing the deaths as hysteria among the weak. Yet arrogance blinds more surely than poison. When he summoned Dr. Hathaway for tonics to steady his nerves during long speeches, Solomon was there, waiting. The draft he prepared was subtle, designed not for quick collapse, but for gradual decline. Ashford grew pale, his speech faltered, his steps slowed. Within a week, he was pronounced dead of mysterious fever. His funeral was lavish, attended by Charleston's remaining leaders desperate to display unity. But when the coffin lowered, Solomon knew another voice had joined the earth's choir of muffled screams. Ashford's death split the city wide. If even senators could not escape, then no man stood safe. Families spoke openly of fleeing north. Slave patrols thinned to shadows, and in the quarters, songs no longer whispered but sung in defiance rose against the night sky. In his journal, Solomon wrote, 8 into the earth. Their crown has fallen. 1 remains. Charleston teetered on the edge of collapse, and the soil waited for its 9th and final sacrifice. Charleston now lived as if under siege, not from armies, but from the soil itself. 8 men of power had been lowered into graves, each coffin echoing with silent terror. The prophecy whispered in markets, on docks, in the quarters, had sharpened into certainty. 9 shall fall, and then the city shall rise. The masters trembled. The enslaved stood taller. The 9th and final name in Solomon's ledger was not chosen for wealth alone, nor for cruelty alone. It was chosen because it symbolized the very heart of Charleston's rot, Governor Nathaniel Rutledge. Rutledge was more than a politician. He was the embodiment of the system, law, trade, chains and blood tied together beneath his seal. His speeches declared slavery eternal, his decrees tightened patrols, his alliances ensured Charleston's wealth remained rooted in human suffering. To strike Rutledge was not to kill a man, it was to sever the head of Charleston's illusion of control. Solomon prepared with care unlike any before. Failure could not be risked. The toxin was distilled into a near-perfect draught, invisible in taste, unstoppable in effect. The opportunity came during a private dinner where Rutledge gathered allies to assure them Charleston would endure. Solomon, attending in silence, poured the governor's wine with a steady hand. Hours later, Rutledge collapsed in his study. His household wailed, calling for doctors who declared sudden heart failure. The coffin was ordered at once, the funeral arranged with grandeur befitting the city's highest seat. Yet when the lid closed, when soil pressed down, Charleston's master of masters awoke, not to command, but to claw at pine boards while the earth claimed him whole. When word spread, Charleston broke. Guards abandoned posts, ships fled the harbor, families packed hurried wagons bound north, and in the quarters, voices lifted not in whispers but in shoot. The 9th has fallen. The earth is free. That night, Solomon sat by candlelight and wrote his final entry, 9 into the soil. Vengeance complete. The city trembles and the earth remembers. Charleston was no longer the same city. It never would be again. When the 9th coffin was swallowed by the earth, Charleston entered a silence unlike any it had known. The city of bells and banquets, sermons and speeches had lost its voice. Mansions once glowing with music stood dark. The harbor, once alive with trade, rocked with idle ships abandoned by fleeing families. The air itself seemed heavy, as though the soil had risen to smother its oppressors. The prophecy was complete. 9 shall fall, and fall they had. For the enslaved, the silence was not fear, it was possibility. They gathered in secret, singing openly now of the shadow who had turned graves into justice. Some believed Solomon was a man, others a spirit, others an angel sent to break chains. They spoke of freedom not as a dream, but as something alive, already breathing in their lungs. The masters had discovered their mortality, and that knowledge shifted the ground beneath every shackle. For the elites who remained, life became a performance of denial. They spoke in hushed tones of rebuilding, of restoring order, but their eyes betrayed them. They no longer trusted food, nor drink, nor even prayer. They walked with the caution of prey, not the pride of rulers. They knew something the soil had taught them. Power can rot, just as flesh does. And Solomon? He vanished into the very city he had unmade. Some said he returned to the pharmacy, blending once more into anonymity. Others swore he fled north, carrying his ledger with him like scripture. A few whispered he was taken by the soil itself, his work finished, his body claimed by the same earth that had devoured his enemies. No one knew, but in Charleston his shadow remained. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind through the graveyards carried his presence. He was not just Solomon anymore. He was the soil, the silence, the reminder that even the mightiest could be buried alive. Charleston would recover, trade would resume, sermons would rise again, and new masters would step into the shoes of the fallen. But the cracks had been carved too deep. Fear lingered in the marble halls, and hope lingered in the slave quarters. The prophecy had ended, but its echo had only begun. 9 into the earth. One city forever changed.